7 sheep stood in a driving rain on the highest shelf of a mountain nobody wanted, and the woman, kneeling among them, had $2.11 to her name. They pressed their dark faces against her coat, 7 of them, all that remained of a breed the whole valley had already written off as a joke, and she counted them the way a person counts the last coins in a purse, touching each one, needing the number to hold. The rain ran cold down the back of her neck and soaked through the wool of her collar and found the skin. Her fingers had gone stiff and pale in the wet. Below her, far down the long slope of stone, the lamps of the town were coming on, one by one, small warm squares of yellow in the blue dusk, and in every kitchen down there, they were saying the same thing they had said all spring, that Della Voss had lost what little sense she was born with, that she had thrown away good money on animals not fit for the stew pot, that a girl, alone on a mountain of rock, would learn her lesson before the year was out. She could almost hear them. She had heard them so many times that the words had worn a groove in her. She did not know yet that within 3 years, men would drive 100 miles over bad roads to stand at her gate, hats crushed in their hands, and beg for the offspring of those 7 soaked and shivering creatures. She did not know that her name would come to mean something in that valley other than pity. She only knew that they were alive, all 7, breathing warm against her in the cold, and that she would keep them alive, and that this, for tonight, was enough. She pressed her face down into the wet slate-gray wool of the nearest ewe and breathed in the smell of lanolin and rain and living animal, and she stayed there until the shivering in her own body matched theirs. And then she rose and drove them down to the shelter of the leaning barn, and she did not weep, because weeping did not feed anyone. 3 springs earlier, Della Voss was 26 years old, and had just buried the second of the 2 people who had ever believed in her. Her great-uncle Emile had come to this valley from the old country with a wooden trunk, a folded knife, and a way of speaking that the neighbors found slow and strange, and he had raised her from the age of 6, when the fever took both her parents in a single hard week and left her standing in a doorway with nowhere in the world to go. He had come for her without being asked. He left her when he died, his 40 acres of stony hillside, a leaning house, a barn that breathed when the wind blew through the gaps in its boards, and a small ragged flock of sheep that the whole county considered worthless. They were an old country breed, dark-faced and short-legged, with wool, the dull color of wet slate, and a stubborn, watchful disposition, the kind of animal that looked at you sidelong as if it were the one deciding whether to trust. The fashion of the valley had long since turned to the big white sheep the wool buyers wanted, animals that grew fat and dumb and gave fleeces by the sackful, and against those glossy giants Emile's little dark sheep looked like a mistake, like something left over from another century that everyone else had agreed to forget. When the old man was lowered into the ground in a cold March wind, the neighbors patted Della's shoulder and told her, not unkindly, that the merciful thing would be to sell the whole lot to the slaughterman in town and be done with it. A young woman alone, they said, could not work 40 acres of rock and keep a barn from falling down around her ears and mind, a flock of creatures that no living buyer would pay a fair price for. It was too much for one person. It was too much, they repeated, for one person alone, as though the phrase itself were a stone they could set on top of her. Della listened to all of it, with her hands folded and her mouth shut, which was a thing she had learned young, that silence costs nothing and buys you time to think while other people spend their words. And she did think. She walked the 40 acres in the raw days after the funeral, and she looked at the land the way Emil had taught her to look at it, not for what it seemed, but for what it did. The neighbors saw stone and scrub and a mountain too steep to plow, ground fit for nothing. But Della saw that Emile's sheep had lived on that mountain for 20 years and grown solid and sound where the big white sheep would have starved in a month. She saw them climb rock the fashionable breeds could not climb, picking their way up ledges like goats. She saw them eat the tough gray brush the fashionable breeds would not so much as sniff. She saw them stand out in weather that would have killed a soft lamb, chewing calmly with the sleet coming sideways off the ridge. There was an old man, 2 farms over, Another immigrant, a Basque named Ignacio Arrieta, who had herded sheep in 3 countries before he was 30 and carried the whole long history of it in the set of his shoulders. When Della came to him with her questions, he sat down his coffee and looked at her a long, unhurried moment, reading her the way he read a sky. "A thing is only called worthless," he said in his slow, accented way, "by people who have not troubled to learn what it is worth. Your uncle knew what he had. He did not keep those sheep because he was a fool or because he was too poor to change. He kept them because he was wiser than the men who laughed at him. Keep them, girl, but keep them right, or they will teach you what right means the hard way." So she kept them, and the town laughed. She sold Emil's old wagon and his good watch and a thin gold ring that had been her mother's, the last small thing of her mother's she owned, and with that money she bought fencing wire and a keg of nails and enough oats to carry the flock through until the grass came green again. The men at the feed store took her coins and counted them slow and shook their heads behind her back before she was out the door. "There goes Emil's girl," they said, "spending her whole inheritance on the one thing in this valley worth exactly nothing. She'd have done better to burn the money in the stove for the warmth of it." The wool buyer, a heavy, smooth-faced man named Harlan Frick, who came through every season in a fine buggy with a matched pair of bays, stopped at her gate that first summer and offered her 40 cents on the head to take the whole flock off her hands. "A mercy price," he called it, leaning down from his seat with a smile as smooth as poured cream. A favor to a poor orphaned girl who plainly did not understand her situation. Della looked at the 7 ewes and the 1 old ram and the handful of lambs standing behind her, and she did the arithmetic in her head quick and cold, and she said, "No thank you, Mr. Head." Frick, and she watched something hard and reptilian move behind his smile for just a breath before he touched his hat and clucked to his horses and drove on down the hill. That first year nearly broke her, and she would not pretend otherwise even years later when the telling of it had gone soft and golden in other people's mouths. She rose before light every single morning, in the dark and the killing cold, before even the birds had thought to stir, and she worked with her hands until they went rough as bark and split open at the knuckles and bled into the cracks. She mended the fence a rod at a time, wire-cutting her palms, posts too heavy for one person, that she sat anyway by leaning her whole small weight against them. She patched the barn roof with tin. She pried off an abandoned shed a mile down the road and carried up the hill on her back, load after load, until her spine felt welded. She learned to shear, badly at first, nicking the poor animals and weeping over the little beads of blood, then better, and then better still, until she could take a fleece off clean in one continuous gray blanket that fell away whole. Old Ignacio came when he could, and taught her the things that are written in no book anywhere. He taught her how to read Ewes' eye for sickness a full day before the sickness showed itself in her body. He taught her how to turn a breech lamb with a soaped hand in the freezing dark, working blind and gentle while the ewe strained, and how to breathe life back into the ones that came still and blue. He taught her how to know by the color and the smell and the very taste of the wind when a storm would blow itself out by morning and when it would turn hard and stay. He never took a single cent for any of it. Watching her learn was payment enough, he said, because it reminded him of himself at that age. Stubborn as a fence post and twice as thick through the skull. And every evening, when the work was done and the animals were bedded and fed, Della sat at Emil's scarred kitchen table with a stub of pencil worn short as her thumb and did her arithmetic, the survival arithmetic, counting what she had against what she owed. And every night the numbers came out too thin. And every single night she refused to let herself despair and simply adjusted them instead, moving one figure here and another there, going without this so she could pay for that, until she found a path, however narrow, that would carry her to the next morning. There was always a way. It was never a good way, but it was a way, and a way was enough. But she was watching all through that first hard year, the way Emil had taught her to watch. She noticed things the valley had long stopped noticing because it had stopped caring to look. She noticed that her dark ewes bred back faster than any white sheep on any neighboring farm, and through twins were the fashionable breeds through singles, and that their lambs stood and found the teat within the hour, and almost never died in the night. She noticed that they grazed the steep sour ground the other farms had given up as useless, turning worthless brush into meat and milk and wool through some patient alchemy of their own stubborn bodies. She noticed that their wool, though it was dull and gray and brought a shameful low price by the pound at market, was extraordinarily fine to the touch, springy and warm and clean, without the greasy weight of the common fleece, and that when she dyed a hank of it, as an experiment on a slow winter evening, it took the color deep and true and held its saya, richer than any white wool ever did. She did not yet know what any of this was worth in coin. She only banked it, all of it, quietly, the way you bank a coal low under ash to keep the fire alive through the night, and she told no one, not even Ignacio at first, because she had learned already that the world does not reward a secret shared too soon. It only laughs at it and finds a way to take it from you. The turning came in her second winter, and it came from a direction she never once thought to expect. A woman named Ruth Callender, who ran a boarding house and a busy cookhouse in the county seat 40 miles off, had bought a length of Della's gray wool cloth from a traveling peddler. Cloth Della had spun and woven herself in the long dark evenings for want of anything better to do with her restless hands. Ruth Callender wore a coat made of that cloth clear through a killing January, standing over her stoves and walking the frozen streets, and she marveled that she was never cold in it, not once. And she wrote to the peddler asking where such wool came from, and the peddler wrote to Della, and by such thin and unlikely threads do whole lives turn on their hinges. But it was not the wool, in the end, that changed everything. It was a wet spring morning, a few weeks later, when Ruth Callender herself drove all the way out to the mountain, plain curiosity having got the better of her, and sat at Della's table and drank her strong black coffee, and asked, almost idly, brushing a crumb from her sleeve, whether the sheep happened to give good meat, because her cookhouse fed hungry teamsters and railroad men who wanted more on their plates than the stringy gray stuff the local butcher passed off as mutton. Della, who slaughtered one wether each autumn for her own table, said nothing. She simply rose and cut a portion and cooked it plain the way she liked it, and set a full plate down in front of the woman without a word of promise or apology. Ruth Callender took one bite and chewed and went still. She took another bite, slower, and then she set down her fork and looked up at Della the way a person looks at a winning card they did not know they were holding in their own hand. "What in heaven do you feed them?" she said. "Rock," said Della. "Brush. The spring water. Nothing that costs a penny." Ruth Callender named a price then, a price for as many head as Della could raise, and it was a price that made Della's ears ring and the room tilt, and the woman said she would take every animal Della could bring her and still want more, and that her old friend who cooked for the fine hotel in the capital would want them too. Because there was nothing like this meat anywhere in the state, lean and dark and sweet, from a whole lifetime of hard, honest mountain grazing. It had worked. The despised thing, the standing joke of the valley, had begun, quietly, at a kitchen table over a plate of plain mutton, to be understood at last for what it truly was. Della told no one still. She banked that too, down under the ash with the rest. But she stopped selling her lambs to the slaughterman in town for pennies, and she began instead to save every ewe lamb she could, building her flock up rather than thinning it down. And she signed a paper with Ruth Callender and another, some months on, with the hotel man in the capital, and slowly, season over season, the thin arithmetic at the kitchen table began to fatten and turn healthy. She fixed the barn properly, board by board, until it stopped breathing in the wind. She bought a good ram of her own breed from a farm 3 counties over, one of the very last such rams left alive in the whole state, and she bred her ewes to him with care, keeping in her head who was daughter to whom, and her flock grew from 8 animals to 19, and then in the following spring to 32, and, the wool she could not spin and weave herself, she now sold to a fine mill in the East that had learned of its rare quality, and paid her 4 times over what Harlan Frick had ever once offered. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed, You cannot hide a full barn and a rising flock from people who have been standing at their windows waiting to watch you fail. But it is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to have mocked it. And so the valley's first response was not wonder, but suspicion, thick and low. She'd found herself a rich fool to swindle somewhere, they said. It couldn't last. Any day now those ugly little sheep would show their true nature, and the girl would come crawling down the mountain begging to sell. Harlan Frick came again in his fine buggy, and his smile was a different thing now, tighter at the corners, and his voice carried a new warmth in it that never once reached his eyes. He had heard, he said that she was doing well, and he was glad for her, truly glad. But a young woman alone in a hard business like this was so terribly exposed, so vulnerable to the smallest turn of luck. One bad winter, one sickness through the flock, and it would all be gone. Would it not be wiser, he said, kinder to herself, to sell him the whole flock now, at a generous and settled figure, and keep herself safe and comfortable? He named a number, and it was large. Large enough to prove that he knew almost to the head exactly how well she was doing. And it was that number, more than anything he said, that told Della the whole truth of him. Because how, she asked him quietly, folding her hands, could he possibly know what she was worth when she had told no living soul her sales? Frick's smile faltered for just an instant, a single crack in the smooth cream of his face, and in that instant, she saw all of it laid bare, that he had been asking around the valley behind her back, tallying her buyers, coveting the breed now that others had begun to want it. Planning to buy her out cheap while she was still called a joke and corner the whole rare thing for himself before the price ran up. She thanked him again and refused him again, and this time, when he wheeled his bays around and drove off, there was no mask left on his face at all, only a cold, flat anger. What Frick did next, he did in whispers, because a man of that make never carries his own knife where a hand can be seen holding it. Ward began to travel through the valley and beyond its ridges. The Della Voss's dark sheep carried a wasting sickness in them, a rot down deep in the blood, and that any farm foolish enough to take her stock would find its whole flock dead in the fields by the first snow. It was a lie built with real cunning, because it was exactly the kind of lie people are hungry to believe. The lie that let every man who had laughed at her keep his old contempt and rename it caution, keep his pride and call it prudence. And it very nearly worked. It came within a hair of working. The mill in the east grew nervous and slow to answer her letters, and the hotel man in the capital wrote a worried, hedging note. And for 2 long, hard weeks, Della sat at her kitchen table in the yellow lamplight and did an arithmetic that came out wrong, no matter how she moved the figures, wrong and wrong and wrong again. And she was more frightened in those 2 weeks than she had been on any night since she buried Emil in the March wind. Old Ignacio found her like that one evening, gray-faced and hollow-eyed over her worn pencil, and he sat and listened to the whole of it without once interrupting. And then he said a thing she never afterward forgot, as long as she lived. "A lie about your sheep," he said, "dies the very moment an honest man lays his eyes on your sheep. A lie cannot stand in daylight next to the truth it lies about. So, stop hiding, show them your sheep." And so she did the boldest thing of her whole life, which was to stop keeping her long secret at last, because the world was finally ready to see it. And because hiding it now, she understood, would only feed the lie and let it grow fat. She wrote a careful letter to the state agricultural fair, held 40 miles beyond even the county seat, and she entered her flock in it. And she loaded 7 of her very finest animals onto a wagon borrowed from Ignacio and drove 2 full days over rough road to stand them in a pen before the eyes of every shepherd and buyer and government official in the state. The county veterinarian examined every animal at the gate, as the rules of the fair required of all entrants, running his hands over them and lifting their lips and listening to their chests, and he pronounced them, loudly and without hesitation, the soundest and healthiest sheep he had put his hands on that entire season. And he wrote it plain on a card in his own hand and hung the card on the rail of her pen for all to read. And then the shepherds came. They came all through the long day, men who had spent their whole lives with the fashionable white breeds and thought they knew all there was to know, and they leaned their forearms on the rail and looked at Della's dark mountain sheep, and at first they came to sneer, the way the valley had trained them from birth to sneer, and then, one after another, they went quiet, because these were men who knew animals in their bones, whatever else could be said of them, and they could see with their own two eyes what a generation of wool buyers had made them forget, that here stood a breed which thrived where others withered, which bred true and easy and through living twins, which turned bad steep ground into good sweet meat, which carried on its back a fleece finer than anything else in the whole yard. One old rancher from the dry country to the south, a leathered man whose land was killing his soft white sheep by the score every summer, stood at that rail for a full hour without speaking, just looking, just thinking. And at the end of it he took off his hat and asked Della Voss, with a rough and genuine courtesy, whether she might see her way to selling him a ram. She won every ribbon her animals were eligible to win that week, blue after blue, but the ribbons were the very least of it, tin and cloth and pretty color. What she truly carried home on the long road back was not the ribbons, but the names and the addresses of 24 shepherds who wanted her stock, wanted it badly, wanted the last true living animals of a breed the whole state had very nearly let vanish into nothing. And she understood, driving that slow road home with her 7 weary sheep swaying in the wagon bed behind her, that the whispered lie was dead now, killed clean in the daylight exactly as Ignacio had promised. That Harlan Frick had reached out his smooth hand for her and closed it on empty air, and that the flock the whole valley had called a joke was now the most sought after in 3 counties, and climbing. It was a strange and dizzying thing to be right at last, right out loud, in the open, where everyone could finally see it. But being right, she was learning slowly, is its own kind of reply, complete in itself, and it needs no gloating laid on top to make it heard. Then the drought came, and it came the way that real disaster always comes in that hard country, not with the drama of a storm, but with a terrible silence, a sky gone hard and clear and cruel and empty, week after week after week, a blue so perfect it began to look like a punishment. It began the summer following the fair, and it was the worst in 40 years, old Ignacio said, standing on the ridge and squinting at that pitiless sky, worse than anything he had seen since the day he first walked into the valley a young man. The creeks that fed the fine farms down in the bottomland shrank first to strings of warm mud and then to cracked dry beds with the stones bleaching in the sun. The lush green pastures that had grown the big white sheep, so fat and glossy and proud, burned away to brittle brown straw that crumbled underfoot. And the great soft animals that the whole valley had staked its fortune and its pride upon began to die, first by ones, then by dozens, then past all counting, because they could not walk the long dry miles to what water was left, and could not stomach the tough dry brush that was all the parched land had to offer. And because they had never once in their whole bred-down pampered lives been asked to endure a truly hard thing and did not know how to begin, farm after farm stood and watched its wealth wither and fall in the fields. The men who had laughed longest at Della now stood at their own fences in the white heat and watched their flocks go down in the dust, and there was no laughter left anywhere in the valley now, none at all. Only the terrible quiet arithmetic of families sitting at their own kitchen tables, reckoning in the dark how in God's name they would eat come the winter. And up on the high stony mountain that nobody had ever wanted, Della Voss's dark sheep did not die. They walked the long dry miles without complaint to the mountain spring that ran cold and clear and steady no matter what the season did, the spring Emil had known about all along, the true and secret reason the old man had bought that worthless-looking land in the first place, 20 years before, when everyone had laughed at him too. They ate the gray brush and the sour scrub that the drought could not kill, because nothing in living memory had ever been able to kill it. They lambed right on their schedule and stood in the merciless white sun, chewing calmly, as if it were nothing at all to them, because they were made for precisely this, bred and hardened over long centuries, in a hard old country, for exactly the kind of year that was breaking every other farm for 100 miles. The fortune of the whole region turned clean over in a single dry season, the way a stone turns in a flood, and the thing that had lain at the very bottom mocked and discounted, and nearly sold for pennies, rose all at once to the very top. And Delavos, 28 years old now, still alone, stood on her mountain, with the only thriving flock in 40 miles in any direction a person cared to ride. Hunger changes a town. She knew that in her bones. She had been hungry herself, plenty of nights, and she knew, standing there, that a woman who has food and water when all around her have, neither holds a kind of power in her two hands that can be turned to either of two very different ends. Harlan Frick understood that too, and he came a third time, and this time he did not trouble to wear the mask at all, because there was no longer any use in it. The buyers he served in the East were frantic for meat and wool, with the whole state's flocks collapsing into carrion, and Della's hardy animals were suddenly worth more than any sheep in the country, and Frick came rolling up to her gate, ready at last to pay a genuine fortune, ready to press into her hands every last dollar he had once schemed and lied to keep from her. Sell now, he told her, leaning down, all urgency and false fellowship, while the prices are mad and climbing. Before the rains break and it all falls back down to nothing again, you could leave this cold mountain a rich woman. You could be shut of every one of them, the whole valley that laughed you to scorn, and never once look back over your shoulder. And Della stood at her own gate and understood with perfect clarity that he was offering her not merely money, but revenge, the sweet, clean chance to gather up her thriving flock and her long bank years of swallowed contempt, and sell them all off to the highest faraway bidder, and let the valley that had mocked her and lied about her and tried to break her go ahead and starve in its own dust. It would have been easy. It would even, some would surely have said, have been no more than justice. She said no. But she did not only say no to Frick and send him down the hill, she turned her whole back on his fortune, and then she did the thing that surprised everyone, the thing they still tell of in that valley to this day. She called the neighbors together, the very ones who had laughed the hardest, and she stood before the whole gathering of them in the hot dust of that killing summer, and she made them an offer of her own. She would not sell her flock away to the East, she told them, not one head of it, no matter the price. She would instead sell breeding stock at a fair and honest and settled price that any of them could reach, to every farm in the valley that wanted to rebuild itself with an animal that could actually live through this country. She would sell her mutton to the local families first, before ever a distant hotel saw a cut of it, and at a price they could truly pay, because a neighbor's empty table came before a stranger's fat ledger, always, and her uncle had taught her that with his life. And to old Ignacio Arita, who had asked her for nothing in all these years, and given her everything he knew, she gave outright a ram and 3 of her very best ewes, and she would not hear a single word spoken against it. The valley stood there in her yard in the heat and looked at her, and some of the men could not bring themselves to meet her eyes, remembering too clearly the things they had said in the feed store and behind their hands. And one of them, the very same feed store man who had counted her mother's ring money, slow, and shaken his head at her back years before, took off his hat and turned it in his hands and said plainly and out loud, so all could hear, that they had been wrong about her, all of them wrong from the first day, and that he was ashamed of it and sorry for it. And Della, who had learned so young that silence costs nothing at all, found this once, that she had words in her after all, and she used them. She said only that a thing is worth what it can do for the people standing around it, and no more and no less than that, and that her Uncle Emile had known it his whole life while the valley laughed, and that she was only glad to have finally come to know it herself. The rains came the following spring, as the rains always do come in the end, and the valley was slow in its healing, but heal it did. And it healed on the strong backs of Delavos's dark mountain sheep, because farm after farm after farm rebuilt its ruined flock with the hardy stock she sold them fair. Animals bred deep to endure whatever that hard country could ever think to throw at them. and the fashionable white breeds that had failed so utterly and so completely in the drought were never again quite trusted the way they had been. Within 3 years of that 7-sheep night in the driving rain, there was scarcely a working farm left in the whole state that did not want her animals, or the animals of her animals, and shepherds truly did drive 100 miles and more over bad roads to stand at her gate, hats crushed in their hands, and ask with real humility for the offspring of the breed that everyone had once agreed to forget. She had saved it. 7 ewes and 1 old ram on a mountain nobody on earth wanted, and she had brought the whole line back from the very trembling edge of nothing, and now it was written permanently into the future of the entire region, into the wool of 1,000 warm coats and the flocks of 100 rebuilt farms. She never grew rich in the way that Harlan Frick had meant when he said the word, because she never once in her life sold at the cruel and gouging prices she could so easily have commanded in that desperate year, and Frick himself simply faded out of the valley and was gone. 12. When the far-off buyers he served at last lost all faith in a man who could not deliver the thing he had promised them, but Della Voss grew something a great deal better and more lasting than rich. She grew necessary. She grew respected. And finally, after so very many years spent alone on her mountain, she grew surrounded, for she took in a half-starved orphan boy the next hard winter, a silent child named Tom, with no people anywhere in the world of his own, standing in a doorway with nowhere to go, and she taught him everything she knew about reading the land and the sky and the eye of a laboring ewe, the same patient way Emil had taught her, and Ignacio after him, passing the banked coal carefully along from one hand to the next before ever it could go cold and dark. The old Basque lived long enough, thank God, to see the boy take his first clean fleece off a ewe in one whole gray blanket, and he sat up on the sun-warm fence rail to watch it done, and when it was finished, he said again, softly, the very thing he had said to her at the beginning of all of it, that a thing is only ever called worthless by people who have not troubled to learn what it is truly worth. And Della, standing there in the doorway of the barn that no longer breathed when the wind came through, looking out over her mountain where the dark sheep grazed, contented on the steep sour ground that every soul in the valley had once sworn on their lives, was barren and dead, understood at last, fully and finally, that the old man had been speaking, all this long while, about a great deal more than the sheep.